Hi, I'm Pat Mangan, Director of Governance Education at NRECA. Welcome to Governance Talk. My guest today is Colette Trohan. Colette, you are a certified professional parliamentarian teacher.
That's correct.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, thanks for coming in. Wanted to talk to you about parliamentary procedure today. Everybody has seen the large book,
Yes.
and it intimidates people. And I hope that by the end of our little discussion today, we can relieve some of that fear that people have about parliamentary procedure. But let's start with a definition. Tell us, in plain terms, what parliamentary procedure is.
But first, let me congratulate you on saying that awful phrase, parliamentary procedure, so well, so many times. It's a little difficult, and right off the bat, it sends off connotations of white powdered wigs and craziness.
And it kind of does.
It does.
Yeah.
And that's, so a lot of times I will say, let's talk about Robert's rules for realists. I tend to avoid the phrase just because of where it starts out. It's really all about two things. It's about order, but not stiffness in order. It's about preventing confusion, because confusion is the absolute enemy in a meeting. And it's about fairness. And fairness is your basic equality. Every single member in a meeting is equal. They all have absolutely equal rights in the process. And that's really the entirety of it. A colleague of mine used to say, it's common sense and fair play codified.
I like that. Very simple and straightforward. I like to think of it as every voice will be heard. Is that really an accurate way to think about it?
It is, in a sense, that every voice that wants to be heard will be. It's also impractical in some meetings, for example, a large House of Delegates or some such thing. It's far easier in a board of directors, but it is every person has equal access to have their voice be heard.
I see. Okay. Very good. So fairness and equity are big parts of this process.
Absolutely.
Making sure that there aren't interruptions, or voices are heard that want to be heard, as you say. Boards will say to me sometimes, though, they get nervous that it will be burdensome. And how would you react to that?
Someone once said to me a long time ago, conflict happens when one person perceives the other is blocking their goals. I find the people who fight the use of a process that basically defines equity and fairness are often the ones that are getting their own way. They're the ones that are controlling the process and don't want to use another process. I find that if a board is worried that it's going to be too much trouble, I think they don't understand that there are no mysteries out there. There are books, there are classes, there are educational opportunities. If they wanted to learn how to play a video game or they wanted to learn how to play golf, they would grab a rule book and they would use that rule book and learn how to do it. This is actually simpler than that in a lot of ways. There are, I think, 184 motions in Robert's Rules of Order. I believe the most they'll ever use is 10.
Okay, that takes a little of the pressure off. Very good. Colette, tell me about some of the myths because I know there are a few of them out there, and I want to hopefully we can dispel some of them today. So what are some of the myths regarding parliamentary procedure?
Well, a lot of people think that, first of all, parliamentary procedure is this mysterious thing that's impossible to learn. So that's the first myth I like to dispel. And then they have myths about the rules and what they mean. Probably the most common is the idea that everyone seems to think that if one person shouts the word question, they're calling the question, and that means that debate must stop. And that's been perpetuated for years and years. Yet if you break it down into its common sense elements, I would like you to think about it this way. How is it in a system of fairness and equity that one person can decide everyone else is finished? It's really a balance. Parliamentary procedure is about the rights of the majority to determine the result, but there's a strong protection for the minority. So calling the question actually requires someone to be recognized in their turn, requires a second, And it requires a 2/3 vote, because by the time we have 2/3 that are ready to move on, the minority has become small enough that the shift comes to the majority to be able to determine the result.
Makes sense. So one person can't shut it down. There needs to be
That's
a
right.
2/3 vote. Very good. What are some other myths that are out there?
There are some parliamentary authorities, because Robert's Rules is not the only one. Some of them say you don't need a second for the motion. And when I look at that, I have to chuckle, because what they're forgetting is that you can also have the tyranny of one. Everybody has known that one board member that is going to continually propose things that are perhaps just not terribly well thought out. If you don't require a second, meaning more than one person wants to discuss something, you are now empowering one person to force the board into areas where not another person on the board wants to go. So you have to recognize some of those things as well. It's all about balance and equity, but protecting rights.
Okay. If I were the chair, newly appointed, what advice would you have for me about learning about parliamentary procedure?
Well, at every NRECA event, I've been teaching for NRECA now for 23 years, and I've taught at directors' conferences, summer school, and winter school. I do 2 classes that I would highly recommend. First of all, because they're geared toward the directors, there's a course for the directors that teaches about the motions and what you'll need, and then we have a course that's specifically for chairs and how to chair a board meeting and the kinds of things that are involved in putting together an agenda, in taking votes, in making sure that you're recognizing people in the proper order. It's all something that can be learned. So my first piece of advice is don't be intimidated, just get educated.
Okay. It's learnable. That we should put the 1,000-page book out of our minds for now.
Yeah, it started out as 176 pages when Henry Robert wrote the book to begin with in 1876. A lot of what has been added has been information people have been clamoring for. But in 2004, the Robert's Rules people decided they'd come out with another book that's called Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised in brief. We have that as part of the materials in the 901.1 course. And I like to talk about it as the Cliff Notes version. I would strongly recommend someone pick that up. As I like to say, it's every bit as boring as the big book. It's just a lot shorter. And the good thing about it is it has references to the bigger book that has more explanation. And then don't be intimidated. Literally, there is a logic to everything that's in there. And once you start stripping away all of those fears and myths, you'll see that there's just a very, very logical progression to the order of motions, to the way things work. For example, you start with a motion. You don't start with discussion. You don't start with talking about what you might want. I recommend that every director who gets an agenda packet that's ready for the meeting, it includes all the motions that are going to be made. They can't have good preparation if they don't know where it's going.
I see.
If you start with discussion, it becomes a personality-based decision because the stronger personalities are going to rule the discussion and create the motion, and those who are less assertive are going to sit back, not wanting to force their way.
I have to be honest with you, when I have talked to directors that are headed for your classroom in the morning, there is, with some, a certain amount of dread because they think to themselves, oh, I've got to do this. And yet, in the first 20 minutes, it seems, there's this transformation. How do you do that? How do you transfer it from something that they dread to something that they really begin to enjoy and get excited about? I've seen that happen.
And I've had to work very hard at that. If they think they're dreading it, those first 20 minutes to half hour, I'm also kind of dreading it. It's as I said one time in a meeting, I'm the Rodney Dangerfield. I have to win them over. I do that a couple of ways, and probably the easiest one is I show them my love for it. I show them my excitement about how this can transform their meetings. I have a very, very deep respect for the idea of equality in meetings. And sometimes I say parliamentary procedure is a way to help boards get out of their own way and get the job done. Because if we can agree on those rules, Once my enthusiasm goes through, once I break it down a little bit and say, don't be intimidated, oftentimes I'll start out by saying, have you ever been to a bad meeting? And we talk about the things that have gone wrong in meetings and get some laughter going. And a lot of the times, the things that went wrong were not things that were in the book. They were things that were opposite. So as we go through the day, we solve some problems. Their biggest problem when they leave is, how do I take this to my board? And I tell them, suggest one small change. And when you do that, suggest it for a month or 2 months, and then let's all reevaluate. Because if they just come in and say, hi there, I took a class and I'm going to change the world, nothing's going to go well for any of us.
It never goes well, does it?
No, it doesn't.
I love that approach. So it's sort of a, let's try a little bit, see how it goes, evaluate it, and then maybe once we're comfortable with that, we may move on to the next thing. It doesn't have to be all at once.
No, it doesn't have to be all at once at all.
Colette Trohan, thanks very much for being with me this morning.
It was my great pleasure, Pat. Thanks so much.